This is Gender Studies 100, lecture number 4 on epistemology. Last time we thought about what the nature of women's oppression is, what are its causes and solutions, and what it means to be a feminist or a womanist according to the writers that you read last time. I'd like you still to be keeping those ideas in mind, but let's move on to the first question that I asked you to think about when you were doing the reading for today, and that is, what is epistemology? Epistemology, as you hopefully have figured out, is the study of knowledge, how we know what we know. So epistemology helps us understand the ways that we come to know things and how that affects what we know. It can be a little mind-boggling, but stay with me and let's go on and look at some feminist epistemologies. We'll start with Gloria Anzaldúa. We can see her idea of mestiza consciousness as a kind of feminist epistemology. So a mestiza is this, notice that for those of you who know Spanish that this is a feminine word, so it's specifically a woman who is of mixed descent or culture or both. So Anzaldúa is talking primarily about Latinas, women in the United States who are of Latin American descent and also living in the US. So they've got two cultures. They're translating between two cultures. She's also talking about women who are of both Spanish descent and Native American descent. So she talks about indios in some of her writing, and that's what she's talking about, is women of Native American and Spanish descent. That's a tricky identity for people who understand the Spanish to have colonized the Native Americans, and yet at the same time, cultures that often see indigenous people as cultures that often deprivilege and oppress indigenous people. Being of both races or both backgrounds can then be a struggle in terms of identity, just as being from Latin America but living in the United States, whether you're born here or not, is also a potential clash of identities. So Anzaldúa sees this clash of identities as productive of a particular type of consciousness, which she calls mestiza consciousness. So let's take a look at the book. Hopefully you have your book with you. If you don't, pause the video and go and get it. Now I'm on page 254, where I will be in a minute. She talks about a new mestiza consciousness, una conciencia de mujer, which simply means a consciousness of women. One of the things we have to think about is, why is it women specifically? And I think in the case of Anzaldúa, what she's talking about is oppression. The ways in which women, because they're an oppressed group or a disempowered group, non-dominant group in society, the ways in which they see the world differently. We'll see a lot more of this when we go on to Hartsock in a minute. So she also talks about, on page 254 again, a consciousness of the borderlands. This is at the very end of the first paragraph. And so here she's again talking about living on the border literally, and this would be primarily the border between the US and Mexico, but also living on the border figuratively, on the border between two cultures, on the border between two races. And that borderland produces a particular kind of hybrid consciousness for Anzaldúa. She sees this consciousness, and now I'm on 255, as moving from convergent thinking to divergent thinking. And she understands convergent thinking, and here I'm 7 lines above the bottom of 255, as analytical reasoning that tends to use rationality to move toward a single goal. And she sees this as a Western mode of thinking. Divergent thinking, on the other hand, and I'm reading again, is characterized by movement away from set patterns and goals and toward a more whole perspective, one that includes rather than excludes. So when you are of two different cultures, when you are, or multiple cultures, when you are of multiple races, it's very difficult to be exclusionary because you would be excluding a part of yourself. So she sees this borderlands consciousness, this mestiza consciousness, as working towards a new kind of thinking that is holistic and inclusive. We can see a little bit of essentialism in this in terms of her understanding of women as particularly prone to this kind of understanding, this kind of consciousness. So that's something to keep in mind. Now for Ansaldúa, being a lesbian is also significant to mestiza consciousness. If you look on page 259, you can see why. She says in the middle of the page, being the supreme crossers of cultures, homosexuals have strong bonds with the queer white, black, Asian, Native American, Latino, and with the queer in Italy, Australia, and the rest of the planet. We come from all colors, all classes, all races, all time periods. Our role is to link people with each other. So again, it's this inclusivity that she's working towards, that she sees specifically being a lesbian as being a strength in working towards that inclusivity. Mestiza consciousness also addresses oppression. In that, again, it's inclusive, but it also lends the mestiza the ability to translate, to speak in two languages, to work from one culture that is oppressed to the culture that is the oppressor, and speak to both to try to address oppression. This is also one of the reasons why Ansaldúa writes partly in Spanish. This is mestiza writing. Because she is from two cultures, she speaks two languages, and therefore, to write about mestiza consciousness, you need two languages. You need a mestiza language, or mestizo language, technically. Okay, if you have any questions about Ansaldúa, write them down now, and I will work on answering them when I get back. Now let's go on to Hartsock. And I want to walk you through this fairly carefully because a lot of this is complicated. Hopefully you were able to use some of the tools for reading theory that I gave you in the last lecture. We can start by looking at Hartsock's thesis. And here I'm on page 316, just about 5 lines down. This is an important part of reading theory, is looking for the thesis statement in the article. There usually is one. It's often at the front, sometimes it's at the back, sometimes it's in both places. Hartsock says, I suggest that, like the lives of proletarians according to Marxian theory, women's lives make available a particular and privileged vantage point on male supremacy, a vantage point that can ground a powerful critique of the phallocratic, that's taking the word phallus and matching it with the word cratic, with the suffix cratic, which means leadership or rulership, with the phallocratic institutions and ideology that constitute the capitalist form of patriarchy. The key part of this sentence is that women's lives make available a particular and privileged vantage point on male supremacy. This is going to be central to Hartsock's argument. Okay. In standpoint theory, Hartsock is not the first person to develop standpoint theory, but she's one of the early people to apply it to feminism and to women specifically. In standpoint theory, there are several levels of reality. And each of these levels interacts with the other. So there's material life, and I'm reading here from the bottom of 316 to the top of 317. Material life, and this is drawing very heavily on Marxist theory, so again, Marx argues that the material conditions of your life influence how you think, who you become, and how you act. So what you think doesn't influence your material conditions in the same way as your material conditions influence what you think and who you are. So there's material life, that's important. And then she says, if the material life is structured in fundamentally opposing ways for two different groups, in other words, there's a dominant group and there's a non-dominant group, there's a privileged group and there's a non-privileged group, then the vision available to the rulers in the dominant group will be both partial and perverse. What this means is that the rulers will not be able to see all of the system of power around them, and therefore their view of the world will only be partial and it will be skewed. That's what she means by perverse. So let's talk about this for a minute. Social power is very difficult to see when you hold it, and not at all difficult to see when you don't. I bet you can name a whole bunch of people who have power over you at Whitman. I probably come to mind. I'm going to be giving you a grade at the end of the semester. George Bridges, Registrar's Office, RAs, RDs, financial aid, all kinds of people. But if I asked you who you have power over at Whitman, you'd probably have to think a while. So imagine this scenario. There's a big party. I know this never happens at Whitman. And somebody gets really, really, really drunk. And they throw up in the hallway. I know that never happens at Whitman either, but we'll pretend. Who cleans it up? Maybe their friends. What if their friends are too drunk? And it just stays in the hallway all night? Who comes in the next morning? The custodian. You have power over the custodians because you have the ability to create messes that they have to clean up and that they can't control. You have power over the landscaping people. Think about that next time you ride your bike across Ankeny. Every summer they come in and replant the grass that gets torn up when people ride their bikes across it. So you do have power over people here. But notice how hard it was to figure out. Power is very difficult to see when you hold it, and much easier to see when you don't. And that's part of what Hartsock is pointing to. So, other levels of reality. She says the vision of the ruling class, or gender, structures the material relations in which all parties are forced to participate. So we've got the material life, which structures social relations. We've got the fact that the ruling class has a particular partial and perverse vision of the world. And yet that vision of the world is what structures the material relations between them and all other groups, because they have the authority and the power to arrange those material relations. In consequence, now I'm on number 4, the vision available to the oppressed group must be struggled for and represents an achievement. So the oppressed group has to work to see the world from its vantage point, because primarily it's used to seeing the world from the vantage point of the dominant group. Finally, as an engaged vision, the understanding of the oppressed, the adoption of a standpoint exposes the real relations among human beings as inhuman, points beyond the present, and carries a historically liberatory role. A standpoint is a perspective from the angle of the oppressed person. So let's go on. We move then from the proletariat to women. She's starting out by using Marxist theory, and that's where she's drawing this standpoint theory from. Marxist theory is what's pointing to all of these material relationships between the ruling class and the proletariat. Hartsock is going to make the move of arguing that women are like the proletariat and men are like the ruling class in terms of how standpoint theory works. So let's take a look at page 317, where she says something very important. This is the bottom of the second to last full paragraph, so it's a little bit below the middle of the page. She says, my focus is on institutionalized social practices and on the specific epistemology and ontology, which is the study of origins, manifested by the institutionalized sexual division of labor. Individuals as individuals may change their activity in ways that move them outside the outlook embodied in these institutions, but such a move can be significant only when it occurs at the level of society as a whole. That means we're not talking about middle-class people or upper-class people as individuals in talking about Marxist theory. We're not talking about the proletariat as individuals. Neither are we talking about individual men when we talk about the oppression experienced by women and the ways in which men are a dominant group. Nor are we talking about individual women when we're talking about standpoint theory. So when we talk about men as a dominant group or men as an oppressor group, there are individual men who are feminists. There are individual men who are not perpetuating patriarchy, but our society as a whole does. And therefore, until the society changes, these arguments hold true. That's what Hartsock is trying to say here. On 318, she talks about a sexual division of labor. I'm at the very bottom, just before, interestingly, just before the heading that actually says the sexual division of labor. The sexual division of labor, she says, means that much of the work involved in reproducing labor power, in other words, not only in literal reproduction, but also feeding the laborer, clothing the laborer, giving the laborer someplace comfortable to sleep, much of that is done by women. And because much of the male worker's contact with nature outside the factory is mediated by a woman, the vision of reality which grows from the female experience is deeper and more thoroughgoing than that of the worker. So women, she says, have a broader understanding of reality, a broader understanding of the world around them than do men. There are epistemological divisions as well. So let's look at page 323. There's a little bit of, so she goes off into psychoanalytic theory here, which can be a little difficult to read, but know that there's a little bit of psychological essentialism going on in this theory. So she makes the argument that men, again, as a class, see the world differently from women as a class. And according to psychoanalytic theory, that happens very early on. So she says, and here I'm at the bottom of the second full paragraph on 323, the boy's construction of self, in opposition to unity with the mother, his construction of identity as differentiation from the mother, sets a hostile and combative dualism at the heart of both the community men construct and the masculinity worldview by means of which they understand their lives. So again, this is a psychological essentialist argument, which makes the point that as boys develop and they have to separate from their mothers, they end up with an antagonistic worldview, which then leads into an antagonistic understanding of the world in men as a class. Again, this is not necessarily saying that individual men have this happen, but rather that many men have it happen, and so as a class, they develop this kind of culture. Women as a class, on the other hand, if we look at 324, women's construction of self in relation to others leads in an opposite direction, toward opposition to dualisms of any sort, valuation of concrete everyday life, a sense of a variety of connectedness and continuities, both with other persons and with the natural world. So again, she's arguing that women and men fundamentally see the world differently because in part of their experiences as early children, and that's the psychoanalytic theory piece that Hartsock is bringing in. But she also brings in a Marxist piece and says also in also because of the material conditions in which men live and the material conditions in which women live. So the conditions of their lives fundamentally shape their view of the world. So how does this address oppression? Let's take a look at 328. She says, the rational and conscious organization of reproduction would entail, and this is not just reproduction like having babies, this is all of the labor that goes into keeping people alive and healthy so that they can be workers. The rational and conscious organization of reproduction would entail the transformation both of every human relation and of human relations to the natural world. The magnitude of the task is apparent if one asks what a society without institutionalized gender differences might look like. And that's a pretty big thing to think about. Now, part of what's important in Hartsock is the idea that the oppressed group has a fundamentally different view of the world than the dominant group, and a broader view of the world. Part of that doesn't come up very clearly in Hartsock's writing is that the oppressed group has to see the world through the eyes of the dominant group because that's what the culture is. If you look around our culture, just to take one example, we know a lot about white culture. You see white people on TV, you see white people in ads, you see white people in movies. We know a lot less about the cultures of people of color. They appear in stereotyped ways and not generally in very rich and in-depth ways. Now, if you're a person of color, you know that not only do you know a lot about white people from all of the society around you, but you know a lot about other people of color, especially people from your own culture as well. So you have a kind of a double vision, whereas many white people, at least along the lines of race, don't. There are other ways in which white people may have a double vision around class, around gender, around sexual orientation, around ability and disability, and other factors as well. Now, if we go on, before I go on, let me pause a minute. If you have any questions about Hartsock, write them down now. Okay, let's look at Narayan, the very next article. This article was written 6 years after Hartsock's article, and it was written in direct response to it. One of the first questions that Narayan asks is, whose standpoint are we talking about? If we're arguing that women have a particular view of the world that helps them fight oppression, how does that relate to white women when they're working with women of color? How does that relate to fully abled women when they're working with women with disabilities? How does that relate to straight women when they're working with queer women? Do they have the same standpoint or not? Narayan would argue that they don't. So she says on the one hand that there's a danger of romanticizing feminist epistemology. If you look on 333, she says feminist epistemology must attempt to balance the assertion of a value of a different culture or experience against the dangers of romanticizing it to the extent that the limitations and oppressions it confers on its subjects are ignored. In other words, feminist epistemology runs the risk of so privileging women's perspective that they forget to notice that there are ways in which women are oppressive of each other. And again, it comes back to whose perspective are we privileging? Which women's perspective? Let's talk a little bit about epistemic privilege. This means, so epistemic, see the word epistemology in here. Epistemic refers to knowledge. And so epistemic privilege is privilege related to knowledge, the ways in which particular groups or particular people's knowledge is privileged. She explains standpoint theory on page 336, when she says, and I'm right below the political uses of epistemic privilege, she says, important strands in feminist epistemology hold the view that our concrete embodiment as members of a specific class, race, and gender, as well as our concrete historical situations, necessarily play significant roles in our perspective on the world. There's Hartsock, right there. Moreover, no point of view is neutral, because no one exists unembedded in the world. This means that objectivity is not really possible, and that's something that we'll have to think about some more. Knowledge is seen as gained not by solitary individuals, but by socially constituted members of groups that emerge and change through history. Now the problem with this, if you go a little bit farther down on 336, is that it tends to universalize the experiences of particular groups and not recognize the ways in which members of those groups are different. So she says, and here I'm, let's see, 4 paragraphs below the new heading. She says, Western feminists, despite their critical understanding of their own culture, often tend to be more a part of it than they realize. If they fail to see the contexts of their theories and assume that their perspective has universal validity for all feminists, they tend to participate in the dominance that Western culture has exercised over non-Western cultures. So in other words, we can't say there is a women's consciousness that all women around the world have. And second wave feminists have gotten into trouble doing that. For instance, deciding that, one of the particular forms of controversy in the past couple of decades has been around female genital cutting, which happens primarily in Africa. It's a traditional practice that involves excising certain parts of female genitalia, usually from young girls. There are a lot of people who, including some people who have had this done, who find it very oppressive and damaging. And so second wave feminists in the West looked at this practice and said, this is awful, we must go free these women. A woman named Gayatri Spivak calls this white women freeing brown women from brown men. They went in without any knowledge of African cultures, without any knowledge of how to go about this, and tried to get laws passed that banned genital cutting. Problem is, in these traditional cultures, a woman who is not circumcised is seen as unclean and therefore unmarriageable. These are also cultures in which men are an important part of an adult woman's life, especially economically. So women, once second wave feminists went in and tried to convince women not to have their daughters circumcised, then they ended up with women who were basically destitute, who had no decent adult life because they were considered unclean. So the better approach, and the one that's been taken more recently, is to go to feminist activists in that particular country. Because notice that the second wave feminists from the West assumed that there was no feminist activism in the places where female genital cutting was happening. So the approach that's been taken more recently by Western feminists in respect to female genital cutting is to contact feminist activists in the countries where it's a concern and say, what can we do to support you? How can we help? And what are you doing that we can support and further? This is very different from a viewpoint that says all women have the same perspective on life and all women need the same thing. So Narayan is trying to point out the importance of being culturally aware when we're talking about standpoint theory. She speaks of the double vision that I talked about earlier. But she also says that there's a dark side to it. So let's take a look at page 338. She has several critiques of double vision. She says that it dichotomizes between public and private life. Let me back up just a sec. The reason that she's wanting to critique double vision is that feminist epistemology has, in many ways, if you think back to Ansaldúa, you'll see this, has romanticized the ways in which double vision work, has said this is a really good thing, we can understand the oppressor's culture and we understand our own, we can translate, as Ansaldúa says, we can see things that the oppressor can't see. And so we have this much better vision of the world, and therefore a better ability to work for social justice. So Narayan says, okay, hang on. One of the problems here is the tendency to dichotomize. If you have double vision, you're living your public life in the vision of the dominant group and your private life in the vision of your own culture or your own identity. So you end up with a kind of a split, almost a double life, in addition to a double vision. And that can be a downside. She also says that as a consequence of double vision, some people end up, if you think about it, if you saw double, literally, it wouldn't be very comfortable. You wouldn't want it to continue. And you'd probably want to fix it. So she says some people react to double vision by simply assimilating to the dominant culture and letting go of their own culture's perspectives, letting go of one side of their vision. The other response that some people have is the opposite, to totally reject the dominant culture, claim only their own culture, and again, drop one side of the double vision. So the double vision is hard to live with, and it's not always a good thing. So how does this critique address oppression? In some ways, Narayan takes us back to mestiza consciousness. If you look at 339, she says this sense of alienation, and here we're talking about the alienation from the dominant culture experienced by people with this sort of double vision, may be minimized if the critical straddling of two contexts is part of an ongoing critical politics. So Ansaldúa gives us the critical straddling of two contexts. Narayan says it has to be part of an ongoing critical politics, due to the support of others and a deeper understanding of what is going on. When it is not so rooted, it may generate ambivalence, uncertainty, despair, and even madness. In other words, let's not let go of the fact that that double vision comes along with the experience of oppression. Okay, if you have any questions about Narayan, take a moment to write them down now. I'd like you to be thinking about what you think of these epistemological ideas, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. And for next time, here's what we're going to discuss. I'd like you to think about what solidarity means to you. I'd like you to think about what the obstacles are to solidarity. You'll be reading a piece by Bernice Johnson Reagan. Why does she say that coalition is dangerous? And finally, what obstacles and opportunities are there for coalition at Whitman? Okay, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Monday.